Hello and dobrý den. Welcome to the first of the Friends of Slovakia 2021 webinar series. I'm Scott Thayer. I'm the chairman of the Friends of Slovakia. We are very pleased to have so many of you joining us today. Looking at the list, I see a number of friends and colleagues from over the years, and so a special welcome. We are especially pleased, though, to have four eminent academics with us today to review and analyze the current state of domestic politics in Slovakia. Tim Haughton is an associate professor of European politics at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He has published extensively on the politics of Slovakia and the politics of Central and Eastern Europe more broadly. His latest publication is entitled The New Party Challenge, Changing Cycles of Party Birth and Death in Central Europe and Beyond, which he co-authored with our next panelist, Kevin Deegan-Krause. Tim will start us off with reflections on last year's parliamentary elections. Kevin Deegan-Krause is Associate Professor of Political Science at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. His research focuses on political parties and democracy in Europe, with emphasis on Europe's newer democracies and its newer parties. Kevin will discuss voter flows, and there may be flaws as well, and party changes before and after the last election. Karen Henderson is an associate professor at the University of St. Cyril and Methodius in Trnava and at the Institute of European Studies and International Relations at Comenius University in Bratislava. Karen moved to Slovakia in 2014 from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Leicester in the UK, although she first lived in Bratislava as a British Council scholar in 1987. Her research has specialized on the interplay of Slovak domestic politics and EU Eastern enlargement and Euroscepticism. Karen will bring us up to date on recent political developments, including strains within both government and opposition parties. Carol Skalnik Leff holds a PhD in government from Harvard University and is Professor Emerita in the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois, where she is the former director of Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Carol is the author of 3 books, one forthcoming on post-communist elite transformation, another on Czech and Slovak politics, and the last on national conflict in Czechoslovakia, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on Czech and Slovak politics, European Union enlargement, and ethnic politics in Eastern Europe. Carol will speak today on Hungarian minority politics in Slovakia, a particularly important area these days, as I'm sure she will let us all know. These presentations will take about 40 minutes in total, leaving 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. A few technical details before we get started. You will all notice that we are using GoToWebinar, which is quite similar to Zoom. GoToWebinar has both a chat function and a question function. Please feel free to use chat throughout the presentations so that you can comment with some or all of the attendees. However, to propose questions, please use the Q&A session. Please use the question function because that directs the material to me and to the panelists themselves. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session. A link to the video of the webinar will be emailed to all registrants at the conclusion of the event. I imagine it will take as much as an hour for it to come out. And lastly, the presentation slides and the recording will be posted on the Friends of Slovakia website in a few days. So without further ado, I turn to Dr. Tim Haughton for our first presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Ďakujem veľmi pekne to the Friends of Slovakia, to Scott and Martina for arranging this, and particularly also to Sharon Wolczyk, who initiated this particular seminar. So thank you for that. So what I'm going to try to do in my 7 minutes or so is to begin the discussion about Slovakia by taking as our starting point the elections that took place at the end of February last year, and use that as a springboard, I hope, to the things that Kevin, that Karen, and that Carol will talk about. And there are three main takeaways I would suggest from that election. Firstly, that electoral systems matter. Secondly, that the theme of corruption really matters. Thirdly, that can take away, but as Kevin is going to talk about that, I won't dwell on that in my allotted slot. Now, I think it's worth starting off by just reflecting on the development of Slovak politics since the 89 revolutions. We think back that the first phase of Slovak politics, dominated particularly by Vladimir Mečiar, questions to do with the nation, to do with illiberalism and Slovakia's place in the world, was then replaced in a second phase dominated by questions around socio-economic distribution. And here is the period that we saw the rise, particularly of Robert Fico, to become the dominant figure of Slovak politics. And I would suggest that Slovak politics is very much coming into a new phase in which particularly issues to do with governability and corruption seem to be central to politics. Now, if we reflect back to the 2020 elections, the most striking thing about that election was the massive rise in support for OLANO in the few months running up to the elections. If we go back to August 2019, we can see that OLANO was languishing in the polls, and yet, if we fast forward to the elections, we can see that the party won a quarter of the vote. Now, a couple of things that I just want to flag up about the election results, which I think are important. So firstly, what's very striking is how new the parliament is in terms of the age of the parties that are in the new parliament. The second thing that I want to flag up here, which I think is very striking, is about leadership. And we can see that without exception, we can debate about Fico's SMER in a moment, but without exception, we can see that at the time of the election, that no party that was represented in Parliament had changed its leader. The final thing that's very striking about that election is are the parties on the right-hand side of this diagram that failed to cross the electoral threshold, including a number of long-standing parties of Slovak politics. The electoral system effects, as I say, is one of the key takeaways. 28% of voters voted for parties or coalitions of parties that failed to cross the electoral threshold. Included within that are the ethnic Hungarian parties, the Party of Most Hid, and I know Carol will talk more about that, so I won't dwell on it, but it's a very significant moment, I would suggest, for Slovak politics. But also what's striking in terms of the electoral system was the way the mechanics of the electoral system played out, particularly the use of preference voting. And we see that 15 out of 150 MPs were elected thanks to preference voting, including 7 from the OLANO list. The second big takeaway is about the importance of the theme of corruption and the theme of the quality of governance. Most of this audience, I think, are acutely aware of dominant figures like Marian Kočner. Anyone who reads Slovak news or watches the Slovak TV, this is a name that's well known to you. And questions to do with the links between politicians, business, organized crime, shady, dodgy figures have been dominant in Slovak politics over recent times, and particularly brought to the fore by the murder of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kušnírová a couple of years before the elections. Now, I'm drawing also here on a couple of my comments from a specially commissioned poll that we commissioned from Focus just after the elections. I will save this audience, all of the boring regression tests and crazy number graphs. But just to say the headlines from our stats showed very clearly that those voters who voted for Matovic's OLANO were those for whom corruption was the key issue. And the second key thing to come out of that poll was how important the campaign was in shifting its votes. Campaigning is a particularly interesting theme for me. I won't dwell on it too much, but just to say 2 or 3 things which I think are important. Firstly, as all scholars of campaigning will tell you, to win an election is about the framing of an election. And what Matovič did brilliantly in the campaign was to really frame the election around the theme of around the theme of corruption, and to demonstrate or to project himself as the person to deal with this problem, this curse facing the country. The second thing that I just want to flag up here is the evidence from the poll suggests very strongly that the campaign was important in terms of mobilizing the electorate and mobilizing people to turn out, but also in terms of conversion, switching votes. It's very clear that if we look in the final month before polling day, a significant proportion of voters did shift, and many of those, a significant proportion, 41%, shifted towards Matovic's OLANO, and a significant proportion of them had moved from 2 of the other new parties, Zaludi and PS Polo, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A during that particular month. Moreover, the evidence shows that voters switched less because they cared about corruption, but there seemed to be more of a bandwagon effect, seeing OLANO as the best vehicle to remove corrupt politicians from power. And if we reflect on that election campaign and the way in which Matovič ran his campaign, it was very striking. He engaged in many of his well-known kind of stunts, perhaps the most striking of which was going to Počiatek's villa in Cannes in the south of France to demonstrate to voters about the issue of corruption. And finally, just want to say one thing that we also found from our poll about what forms of communication seem to be very important. What's very striking, was very striking to me from these data, is actually how important the pre-election debates were. What's also quite striking is that we were expecting a much higher score for social media. And the final thing, which is very striking, anyone who goes to Slovakia during election time is always confronted with a forest of billboards, but it was very striking that billboards, according to respondents anyway, had very little impact. I can see in the audience that Aneta Vilagi is there, and what's interesting, I know that she has a paper which suggests that the pre-election debates didn't have much of an impact, and she used a different methodology, so she may want to come back in Q&A and we can debate and discuss how significant these findings are. And I hope I haven't exceeded my 7 minutes or so, but just to finish with this great slide from Shuti Denik-N's cartoonist, Demokracia je makačka. It is a difficult and tough job.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. And Kevin is in the chair.
Hello, everyone. What I would like to do is to talk a little bit about Slovakia's politics from the frame that Tim and I have been using over the past several years. And I want to deal with something that actually is quite resonant from our own research, which is the fact that Slovakia's politics looks to an outsider, even to an insider, pretty strange. And we have a situation in Slovakia where, if I can get it right, it hasn't stopped changing over time. Slovakia's politics has been really a history of change ever since the very beginning of its democratic period, particularly in the area of party politics that Tim and I focus on. And what I want to do is just lay out a little bit of the framework of how to understand what looks crazy, to maybe understand it in some ways as a little bit more normal, but also to understand it as an ongoing cycle, an ongoing series of changes that just don't seem to stop. And I want to use this graphic about the election as a starting point for looking at the big picture of what the changes in Slovakia's political life have been like. So I want to take that election circumstance, and I want to talk about that in the bigger perspective. And I want to suggest that the political system, the political party system in Slovakia, it's volatile and young, it's drawn to charisma, obsessed with novelty, not unlike a certain famous Slovak that many of you have heard of. But despite that, and although all of those things seem rather ominous, to end with at least a brief note of hope, because I think despite all of those things and some inherent problems that they bring, Slovakia seems to have weathered those difficulties and managed relative success. So these aren't killer, but they are things to be wary of, and they're things that need to be explained and dealt with. So one of the things that some of you have, who I've talked to, and the audience is an amazing audience. I'm delighted to see all of those faces out there. One of the things that we have seen that Tim and I have tried to do is for every country in the post-communist Europe is to draw a chart starting in 1990 and going all the way to 2020 of every single political party, how popular it was at a given time based on its electoral results and how it changed. This is Slovakia's. It's a mess. There are parties everywhere. There are splits and splinters. There are mergers. There are changes. There are new parties popping up all over the place. If you're as excited and slightly weirded out by this graph as I am, Tim and I are soon going to be making these available on Etsy, and I'm actually not kidding because we think they make some great gifts. But this is Slovakia's party system. It is complicated. It is really quite unusual, at least by the standards that Americans are used to, by the standards even that most Western Europeans are used to. This is really an unusual situation. And that change that we saw at the beginning that everyone expected to stop once the country matured has not stopped. And it continues all the way to the present day. So the 2020 elections, as Tim noted, saw the emergence of multiple new parties, which got anywhere between 3% of the vote and 7% of the vote. The rapid growth of other new parties from 11% in the previous election to 25% in this election. The drop of significant parties like SMER, SD, which dropped by 10% in this election. And it hasn't stopped there because since that election, we've seen the split in SMER, one that has sent SMER plummeting and its successor Hlas SD rising. And also we see an emerging split now within Kotleba's movement. So even in the last year, it hasn't stopped changing, even after this big election of changes. And I want to give you a sense of what the magnitude of those changes are by using the figures that Tim and I have been dealing with. So one of the things that we calculate is the degree of volatility. This is the number, the minimum number of voters who change parties from one election to the next. And you can see in Slovakia, that has hovered around 25 to 30% in every single election. And again, this is a low estimate. So it's hovered around 25 to 30% in every election. And in the last year, just with the splitting of SMER, if we look at public opinion polls, even in 1 year, we see a change of about 27% of all voters in Slovakia now saying they're going to vote for a different party than they voted for just last March, not even a full year. And when we compare this to the really volatile Eastern European region, Slovakia is high even in the most volatile region in the world. It's above average from almost all of those cases. One of the other things that Tim and I look at is the share of political parties that were born in any given period. So here we've got, the dark blue or the purple are parties that were born in 1990, and the dark blue are parties born in 1992. If you look at this, the share of votes to parties born in 1990 has dropped at an exponential rate, as has the one of parties voted in 92 and 94 and 98. And every single time, get the emergence of new political parties taking a really strong position. And if we add just the most recent public opinion polling data, even in 1 year, with the emergence of Hlas, the exact same phenomena is there. And this doesn't even include what we might see with the results of splits in Kotleba's movement. So this constant emergence, every single election, there is something new and something really significantly new in Slovakia's party system. And what that means in practice is that the age of Slovakia's political parties is pretty stable, but stable in the sense that even though Slovakia is getting older, its party system is not changing at all. They've discovered the fountain of youth, and Slovakia's party system stays young. Tim and I were joking that Slovakia's party system has been 10 years old ever since it was 15. My wife would actually say that about my level of maturity as well. But it has remained young. And in this case, young's not great because it means parties are new, they're inexperienced, and so on. And again, just adding the 2020 numbers, the exact same thing happens. We see actually the party system getting younger even as time elapses. And it's younger than almost every system in the region. It's younger then and now than it was before. In addition, these newer, younger parties have particular characteristics. They don't care much about issues, and you can see on its scale for all the parties in the region on issue importance, Slovakia's OLANO, for example, is extremely low. They tend to prioritize the leadership of the party over the membership of the party. So membership figures on these are pretty low, but leadership is really high. And as Tim pointed out, not a single political party in Slovakia's parliament at the time of the election had ever changed its leader, ever. That's an amazing thing. Same thing is true. It tends to emphasize charisma over social ties. And so we get that really strong dimension as well. And this is the last thing I really want to say about this, this is a cyclical process. What we see in Slovakia's system is that new parties emerge. When they die, they don't send their voters back to the old parties. They go to newer parties, yet newer, and so on. And this constant pump toward the new yields an ever younger political party system, and one that has a difficult time maintaining those long-term time horizons that are necessary for good public policy. And that's a big problem. And yet, and I promised an and yet despite this rapid change, this excessive novelty, Slovakia seems to have managed to produce some of the best political leaders in the entire region, and a set of policies that actually work, where the COVID rates are relatively low despite problems, where other public policy indicators are quite strong. So this is only one issue, it's only one problem, but it is something that we need to think about when we think about Slovakia's party system, and the fact that it continues to be young. I think for a lot of us in this panel who are growing older, it serves as a constant source of hope that we can actually somehow manage to maintain our youth and vibrancy and at the same time be serious. That's all I want to say about that. And it is now my time to hand it over to Karen.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Hold on just a moment. And I need to find the right button. So I'm going to stop sharing and hold on. Martina, are you able to? Yeah, there you go. Great. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I've kind of got the straightforward, easy presentation to do, which is just catching up on what's happened since the election and what's going on now. And kind of, we're all outsiders talking about Slovak politics, but I'm the one who's sitting in Bratislava doing it. To start with just the basic context, the election was on 29th of February. That was 6 days before the first COVID-19 case was announced in Slovakia. The outgoing Pellegrini government locked down really early, so there was no first wave in Slovakia. It felt like we had a first wave because we were completely locked down, the borders were closed. There was a Facebook group called Stuck in Slovakia. It was about, it's all Slovaks living in Britain who get stuck in one country or the other and can't move between them. So, but, you know, in terms of cases, for months on end, Slovakia had the lowest death rate in the EU. It was 28. The problem, however, was that Matovič, the incoming prime minister, was very slow in locking down again at the end of the summer when the figures were clearly going up, and the figures have been very high in the second wave. And you have to remember on the Slovak figures that they're much higher than they look in the tables because of the testing regime here, where the majority of tests are quickie antigen tests, and the international practice is that tables only show laboratory positives, PCR tests. So Slovak infection figures are twice as high as they look, and it is slowly, in terms of, it's got one of the worst death rates in the EU at the moment. Then party instability has been discussed, as well as the fight against corruption, arrests of judges, former police presidents. Today it's been financial administration, tax administration, people from the last government who have been arrested. But, you know, that's, apart from COVID, the fight against corruption is the main thing that's been going on. So how's the party system been moving? If you can't see all the figures on this table, don't worry. There are three things that come out of it if you look in the shifts of preferences since the election. Firstly, the preferences of Matovič's OLANO, ordinary people, have consistently been going down from 25 now to 10. Not a great surprise, because as Tim said in the outset, they did much better than anyone expected in the election. So they're getting back down to their kind of natural percentage levels at the moment. At the same time, their most important coalition partner, Richard Sulek's Freedom and Solidarity, has gradually been creeping up in the polls. So the kind of the balance of power in the coalition is shifting a bit. Second point that comes out from the middle of the table, there's a load of parties around the 5% you need to get into parliament. And again, what will happen long term depends on the ability of the Liberals and the kind of centre right to stop all forming their own parties and consolidate in some way. And then the third thing that's important is that there has been a shift from the centre-right government parties to the left national opposition parties. And the main thing that's happened is Fico's SMER, Social Democracy, split, and Pellegrini's new Voice, Social Democracy, is now in opinion polls the single most popular party. Following that, trust matters. It's interesting that President Čaputová, whose party didn't even get in the last elections, is the only politician who more people trust than don't trust. She's followed by Pellegrini, but still, you know, half the population don't trust him. Quite interesting if you look at the government parties and see that Matovič, the OLANO leader, is the least trusted of the leaders of the government parties, but he's still above the leaders of the other two opposition parties, Fico and the fascist party leader, Kotleba. The Prime Minister Matovič is kind of like an ordinary person, kind of, yeah, alpha male from a provincial town maybe, but he reacts emotionally to some things, does what an ordinary person would do faced with a problem. It's generally thought he didn't really want to be prime minister. He preferred standing on the sidelines complaining about other people protesting, but he took the responsibility when the office fell into his hands. Although some things he does, particularly on COVID, are a problem, in other senses, there's a certain level of honesty and you could predict what happens. But he has an obsession. Prime ministers get this sometimes. Miklos Dzurinda was obsessed with flat tax. It was his trademark. He believed it was his contribution to human civilization. And Matovič believes that testing everyone in the country with little quick antigen tests where they shove something up your nose and tell you the result 20 minutes later. He thinks that's the answer to COVID. First time they tested the entire country in a weekend, it was fun. You thought you were doing something. Last weekend, they did it again, and I thought, oh, please, 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 give him an obsession with vaccinating people. That would be much better. The vaccination rates plummeted down over the weekend because everyone was too busy doing these little tests. The other problem with him as Prime Minister, how to argue with your coalition partners. He argues with Sulik, the guy on the right, who, when they formed the government, wasn't sure whether he was going to wear a mask. They argue a lot about mass testing. Often people don't like their coalition partners and the government falls apart near the end. I've not seen two politicians in a coalition argue the way these two do. You know, they call each other idiots on the radio and things like that. It really is quite annoying to a lot of people who would rather they just solve the COVID crisis. Of the other government parties, Boris Kolawi are the family. I thought this party was in trouble because he was very badly injured in the car crash recently. In fact, he's back at work now, but his popularity has taken a bashing, partly because under lockdown people didn't like all the stories of him arguing with the nurses because he had his girlfriends making tea for him all times of day and night when everybody else in hospital in Slovakia wasn't allowed to be visited by their family even if they were dying. So he may be on the way out. Onto the opposition. Pellegrini's party is very popular, but potentially it has problems. It's not clean from suspicions of corruption, although they managed to sort of push a lot of that bad feeling onto Fico. And Kotlebet, People's Party are Slovakia, the far right. This party has just split. He tried to change the rules without consulting other leading principles, and there have been jokes around that, you know, if you don't like the Führerprinzip, perhaps you shouldn't be in that sort of party. But certainly, also given his legal problems, then the chances that their popularity may drop is there, although their opinion poll preferences are still there. Now, just sort of finishing off medium-term prospects, they are starting to develop the feeling that corruption won't succeed. The number of really high-level people who have been arrested is noticeable, but the corruption process has to be perceived as not being corrupt. And there's already been one dubious case where a former police president committed suicide in custody, which the opposition tried to politicize. The real question I think that everybody's interested in is, you know, the corruption that's being prosecuted at the moment is sort of getting nearer and nearer to Fico and SMER SD, and you know that's could bring about the big shift in Slovak politics. Party realignment is also going to happen, and we don't know why, and we get all these shifts that Tim was talking about just before elections, and the problem with the 5% clause. The next parliamentary election, as scheduled, is shortly before the next presidential election. There's a 4-year term and a 5-year term. That potentially could make it very interesting. In terms of government stability, Pellegrini is trying to collect signatures and have a referendum about having early elections. Well, if you're the most popular party leader and party, why not give it a go? But this government has still a constitution changing majority, a 3/5 majority. It may look incredibly fractious, and there's some days you can't believe this government could survive, but it has strong reasons to stay together. Both Sulik and Matovič, the two party leaders, have already paid the price of bringing down their own government in 2011 when they didn't vote for Iveta Radičová. Also, apart from Matovič's party, the other three coalition partners are all dispensable. He could still have a majority without one of them. Probably they will stick together, and perhaps the government will collapse, 6 months before the election are due when somebody wants to distance himself for it. So that's a very, very quick and not very scientific introduction. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Karen. Our last panelist is Carol Leff, who will be speaking I think a unique issue in Slovakia, Hungarian politics.
Yes, I'm answering a question that asking a question that you know the answer to. After 30 years, what happened to the Hungarian minority representation in parliament? And the answer is there isn't any. Okay? So I want to talk a little bit about what happened, and because it isn't a temporary problem, it's a chronic problem. And you can see in the pattern of parliamentary representation over time here that on the far left here in green, that various iterations of the Magyar Coalition or the Magyar Community Party over time in green, then succeeded by Most Híd over the elections from 2010 to 2016, only to fall below the threshold. Okay, and we saw that at the beginning, and again to point out both Most Híd and an electoral Hungarian coalition of almost 4% split the vote, and we also see the decline and fall of the Christian Democrats and the Slovak National Party. So what I want to look at is a couple of things that make this not very surprising, although it's important to maintain a Hungarian minority presence at the national level. The first thing is the size of the Hungarian population and the fact that it's slightly shrinking from almost 11% in 91 to something like 8.3% as an estimate in 2018. And that's important because of the 5% threshold. The 5% threshold is a very common cutoff point for European parliamentary politics. But what it means for Hungarians is not so much that they have no chance of parliamentary representation. What they don't have is any kind of hope for parliamentary representation if the Hungarian vote splits. Okay, so one party possible, two parties a problem. And that leads to my second point. Although the Hungarian parties have perhaps been more stable over time than ethnic Slovak or national Slovak parties, there has always been a pattern of multiple currents in the Hungarian political community, currents that started out with the exploratory 1990 elections, but only consolidated into a single party rather than an electoral coalition of diverse currents because of Mečiar and his deliberately restrictive electoral law in 1998. So that party could be fairly sure of parliamentary representation, provided that there were no splits. Okay. But when their attractive leader, Bela Bugar, who was attractive to Slovaks as well as Hungarians, lost his chairmanship of the party, he ultimately quickly left and fairly quickly formed a rival bridge party, and it is Mosti, a bridge in Hungarian and Slovak. So you see that he supplanted the Magyar Community Party in 2010, but in the process diminished Hungarian representation, both because the split meant there were fewer MPs, but also that some of them were Slovak. Third point, the historic identity dimension in Slovak politics was the Slovak National Party against other minorities, but the organized one was Hungarian. And so you see this famous billboard where the Slovak National Party encourages you to vote for them to protect your neighbor from becoming an enemy. And you see, everyone knows that Hungarians have those big bushy mustaches, so it's very clear that this nice guy on the far left of the billboard is transforming into something that looks very militant. But what happened in the last 5 years is identity politics shifts a little on its axis toward anti-immigrant politics and anti-Roma politics, but that almost goes without saying in most of Europe. And that the Slovak National Party becomes less important than the extremist Kotleba Party, which now has his name as well as his leader, his sort of leadership, you know. So that led to a strategic choice that I think is pretty important to bear in mind, which is that over time, the support for the Hungarian minority party in opposition or in government was for the right of center pro-European parties, and not for Mečiar and not for Fico. In 2016, a different choice was made, and a rather startling coalition, because here we come to a moment of in which the divisions within the Hungarian community really coincided with their relatively small size, the electoral threshold, and the decision to join a coalition which crossed the ideological line to the left of center with SMER, but also to join an electoral coalition with the Slovak National Party. And that particular choice was controversial in the party, caused a modest, but you could see a slight, popularity hit still above the electoral threshold. But finally crashing when the desire to stay in government outweighed what I think we all know is a critical mobilizing issue in Slovak politics, corruption. When Jan Kuciak and his fiance were assassinated and the government was under fire, Bugar stayed but the government did not leave it. And at that point, his parliamentary delegation began to fracture. There was a failure to bring the parties together. Okay. So how to salvage a situation in which, I don't have time for this slide, but it sort of tracks the orange line falling below the threshold. What now, okay, for Hungarian politics? Well, first of all, they're in a good position to maintain strength at the regional and local level. But here's the last point I want to make. What will be critical is if the promise of August 2020 to realign comes to fruition. I just want to point out these three Hungarian politicians are doing a very good job of looking like Slovak politicians, because you notice the open-throated shirts and the sort of almost beards. Okay. And this is going to be necessary because here's the focus poll of this month. You can see the parties are, the individual parties are still below the threshold. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you to all of our presenters. It's been a bit of a fire hose for all of us. I'm sure there will be a lot of good questions because there's certainly a lot to discuss. Let me start, however. Our first question comes from Sharon Wolchik, who is a professor at George Washington University, a member of the board of the Friends of Slovakia, and Sharon was to be the moderator of this event. Unfortunately, she has come down with a case of COVID, which she is working her way through successfully, but nevertheless was not in a position to participate fully in the event. But like any good academic, she sent along a question. So we will start with that. Sharon's question being, to what extent is Slovakia an exception to the backsliding seen in some countries in the region, like Poland and Hungary in particular? I don't know who, maybe Carol, you'd like to start with that, and others can chime in.
Okay. I'm sorry, did you say Karen?
I said Carol.
Oh, okay. Okay. Slovakia is interesting. It constantly faces threats to the democratic quality. It's been battling with those since the 90s and constantly manages to sideline those threats just enough. Not that the quality of democracy in Slovakia is perfect and it riddled the corruption issue, but between a mobilized public and a public that, when the chips are down in elections, does not vote, some of the most serious challengers into power or manage to vote them out. I think it is, distinctive compared to Poland and Hungary.
I think political parties do explain a lot about the difference. What we've seen in Hungary in particular, thanks to a different electoral system that magnifies the votes of parties, is the absolute dominance of one political party. They're able to get a constitutional majority. That's a huge factor in democratic backsliding. In Poland, not quite as simple, but still consolidation around a particular political party. One of Slovakia's saving graces has weirdly been the kind of fragmentation and continual novelty that we've talked about. It makes governance harder, but it makes political competition easier, and it makes it more difficult for any one party to get a dominant position. And Carol's absolutely right. In the one time when Slovakia was in danger of moving in that direction, when Fico actually managed to get a parliamentary majority, for reasons that I still have a hard time understanding, but may just relate to internal politics or lack of desire, he didn't turn his majority into a kind of proto-dictatorial new kind of regime. And so, between a combination of luck and good behavior and fragmentation, Slovakia's managed to stay away from the biggest of the dangers, which doesn't mean that corruption and fragmentation aren't dangerous, but they're dangerous in a less acute way, more chronic.
And I think one thing that Slovakia has in its advantage is what happened in the 1990s. And I think Slovaks have a sense of efficacy, a sense that they can do something about it because they learned what to do in the mid-1990s, and they'll just do it again. They'll go out onto the streets. I mean, the willingness of people just to go out on the streets here and to organize is noticeable, and people here know how to fight for democracy because they did it. They succeeded. Also, I think Slovakia is exceptionally sensitive to international opinion still, that being accepted by foreign communities is considered very, very important here. And if you look at parties like Meč's party and the Slovak National Party, the huge efforts they made to join a transnational party organization, because the centre-right had set up a discourse that if you were a proper respectable party who could defend Slovak interests, you were part of an international organisation. You know, you don't get that discourse of transnational organisations being really important anywhere else. You know, what the rest of the world says matters here still.
The next question is directed to Dr. Haughton and Dr. Henderson. Both touched on the topic of corruption and its perhaps prominent role, I don't think perhaps, in the elections. To what degree will the electorate continue to respond to parties with strong anti-corruption themes? And could the issue be co-opted by multiple parties in potentially divide the voting public's allegiances?
Shall I go first?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the reason why corruption is an important issue is that there are some corrupt activities that go on, and that corrupt activities are perceived to be taking place. So there's the fuel of those fires that exist. And given that, and as long as there are corruption scandals, the likelihood of corruption being an important issue in politics is going to remain. Moreover, to link it into the work that Kevin and I have done more broadly across the region, we see one of the problems with anti-corruption appeals is they're very easy to make in opposition, they're very difficult to deliver on in government, and they create an easy space for another new party to move into to claim that they are going to resolve the issue of corruption. So I think there's a strong likelihood that this theme of corruption is going to be a strong one in the coming years. Of course, who knows what's going to be important in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. One of the interesting other related questions to that, which is what we're seeing across the globe because of the pandemic, we're seeing questions of competence becoming important in terms of delivering goods and delivering outcomes, and how politicians are responding to things like the pandemic. So maybe issues of competence will become more significant. Could these be co-opted by series of parties or groups of parties? I mean, absolutely, it's possible. If there's one thing probably all of us who study Slovak politics would agree on, it's very difficult to predict the future, but it's a fun and enjoyable ride following the politics of this country.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add there, I mean, a lot of people can still remember how Robert Fico and SMER pushed the anti-corruption issue at the moment, and then did the classic populist party thing. They came into government and took it over. The interesting thing, though, is that the sort of left nationalist governments have always tended to have one dominant party. This government, to an extent, it sometimes looks very, very fractious, but they do quite successfully control each other. I'd rather have Sulik and Matovič together running COVID-19 than one of them on their own. And the other two coalition partners, well, certainly the Zaludi does make useful input to that as well. Also, I think times change, and Igor Matovič set himself up as a successful business person before he became a politician, so he doesn't actually need to steal from the state. I don't think, you know, and I don't think that's why he entered politics. He entered politics because he liked criticizing other people, and now he's ended up running a country instead. So yes, you can always use the corruption issue, but you know, if they can successfully get the discourse going that they're fighting corruption, and you know that the high level arrests really are impressive. The opposition has a lot of voters who actually don't seem to care very much about corruption, so it doesn't matter what you prove to them, they just won't believe it, or they won't care. But there's people in the middle of the spectrum who would, and of course gradually you do change an environment once people believe that stealing from the state is not a costless stunt, that you know you could be caught. it stops being in the system that people do it. So, you know, I think they are making progress. I think they will, but, you know, it could unravel.
Our next question comes from Ambassador Todd Sedgwick. You can always count on ambassadors to have questions that go to the heart of statecraft and state administration. Ambassador Sedgwick's question: why did Čaputová and Kiska's great popularity as presidents fail to translate into support for their parties?
I'm very happy to start off, and then others can add and embellish. So just on, so if we start with Kiska, one of the striking aspects about that was, if you followed the campaign, essentially Fico and Pellegrini and SMER really directed a lot of their fire at Kiska. It looked as if Kiska would be the most likely replacement kind of prime minister, that Zaludi would potentially be, you know, and given that SMER really directed a lot of fire in that direction. And if you looked at the Facebook pages of SMER in the election, a lot of it was pointing out about the fact that, you know, Kiska would do this, he would open the doors, all of these immigrants would come in, and he would do, whereas SMER would give kids proper food at lunchtime. This was a sort of framing that SMER used. Moreover, there was allegations and grainy videos of Kiska being involved in dodgy activities, alleged dodgy activities, that was used quite effectively in that in the campaign to try to attack Kiska. So one of the reasons why the Kiska's popularity didn't translate was because of SMER's campaign attacks. In terms of Čaputová and PS, I mean, what's worth stressing here, I mean, Čaputová, as soon as she became president, did the typical thing of saying, I'm a president of all Slovaks, and distancing herself away from the party to some extent. Moreover, and this goes back to one thing I didn't talk about in terms of electoral system effects in any detail, but worth stressing, that Progressive Slovakia and Spolu went together in a coalition. Because that was an electoral coalition, they had to win 7% of the vote, and they failed by just under 1,000 votes to cross that. So a few more votes, and maybe we would have been talking about a success in a way. We'd certainly be talking about a different kind of government. The reason why PS Spolu didn't do quite so well, I would suggest that there are a few factors here. One, they directed a lot of their fire during the campaign to Kotleba rather than against Fico. So it was Matovič that looked as if he was the figure that would defeat Fico. Secondly, they ran a campaign in which they tried to go around the country. It was actually rather good. They visited every hamlet of Slovakia, but arguably, campaign scholars would say, well, they didn't do enough to maybe mobilize their base in Bratislava in particular. So I think those kind of factors, plus there was the confusing, complicated nature of that electoral coalition, and the leadership of Truban in particular. He came under some fire because of scandals in his personal life and the like. So it's a sort of combination of those factors that help explain why PS Spolu didn't do as well in the election as a number of people were expecting.
With these new parties too, there does seem to be a timing effect, and it's difficult to know exactly when the right time to enter the election is. But you know, often these new parties start off rather strong. And then decay as others attack them, provide alternatives, and so on. So actually, if you look at Zaludi, at a certain point, they were the second or third party in the overall list, and thought to be the leader of the opposition. But it's difficult to time these things, right? And in a weird way, there are two competing imperatives. One is to have enough time to get your name out there, to get people to vote for you, and build up some organization, but you don't want to be out there too long, because then you start to get a little bit stale, and either a new party or an old party with some new tricks like OLANO can interject itself in that space. And I think Zaludi really picked in some ways inadvertently picked probably exactly the wrong time, neither enough time to build up a strong organization nor a brief enough window to maintain the gloss.
Yeah, you have to remember, Chaputova, the reason she became president was as soon as the parties put their candidates into television debates, she was good and her preferences started going up. And the center rights candidate, who was a boring older man, his preferences went down and he withdrew. So it was both the consolidation of that sector of the political spectrum, plus the fact that she was good, that won her the election. And as Tim said, you know, the leaders of PS Spolu were not particularly good, convincing politicians. And the fact that Haludi, PS and Spolu couldn't find common ground, that Spolu still insists on, you know, Spolu and PS actually sit in different groups in the European Parliament. I mean, how crazy can you get? You know, I mean, they didn't, you know, Spolu should have decided where it belonged instead of insisting on being a special party, and they paid for it.
I also think, and I just want to circle back quickly to Tim's initial point. What makes a popular president, and I think this is true in some other East European countries, does not necessarily make a popular party political leader. Okay, and precisely for the reason that Tim said. Okay, and it's very striking how popular the president remains at this point, even though her party failed.
Thank you, Carol. The next question harkens back to not the election last year, but 4 years previous. There was a bit of counterintuitive action when Most Heed agreed to cooperate with SNS in the Fico government. And I was wondering, or rather the questioner is wondering, why, other than raw power desire, would they do that? Since it seems to be counterintuitive that a Slovak Nationalist Party and the Hungarian Minority Party would collaborate.
Do we need an explanation other than raw power?
Yeah. No,
I think the answer might be built into the question.
I think we keep hoping for nobility.
Yeah. No, I think it was a calculated risk. It clearly was unpopular with a certain amount of the base of the party and with some of its MPs, but it was a calculated risk that would not have, I mean, junior partners always have problems, okay? But one of the things I think the calculated risk was based on was the fact that the relevance of the Slovak National Party, the National Party had faded. They, you know, and it didn't seem like as much of a player as it had been in the past. And I think that Bugar is probably counting on that. You know, that the big nationalist enemy now is actually further right than that, and it might even have survived had it not been for, you know, had it not been for the big anti-corruption mobilizations that the party handled so badly later. Okay. And SNS will be in any coalition. I don't think there's any doubt of that.
I do think one of the interesting things is that, you know, those of us who lived and breathed Slovak politics in the 1990s, when the Slovak-Hungarian divide was in some ways the sharpest, and even the divide among Slovaks about Hungarians was what split Slovak parties, it does suggest the ability of, you know, a fairly long-term period of relatively peaceful coexistence to actually mitigate the perceived seriousness of problems. You know, after 20-25 years of not Hungarian irredentism, you know, and people working together and, you know, voting across lines and so on, you know, the idea that you could have Hungarians and the Slovak National Party in coalition, I think, was a sign that, you know, the salience of that particular issue had declined in favor of other issues.
I mean, power is an important issue in Slovak politics, because if you're in government, you can put your people into crucial bits of the state administration, you know, and particularly if you're a Hungarian party and you want to control the communities and the resources in the south of Slovakia. You have to be in government. And the same goes for the nationalists as well. You know, it's not just power, it's the power, you know, being in government.
Patronage.
Do things.
We are over time. I have one last question that I think is an interesting one, or potentially so. Having spoken about the role of the Hungarian minority, there is another minority, which is the Ruslan minority in the eastern part of the country. Do they have a political or economic position? Are they significant in one or more of the parties, or perhaps this is a, well, I can see Kevin or Carol, perhaps.
Yeah. It's not a large group. It's not a group whose electoral base is something that people have to court. And you know, they live in a region where the big hot button minority is probably Roma. I mean, that's true everywhere, but it's certainly true in the East. So I don't think that they have really, that the Rusians have really been able to, you know, to be a player in this, you know, in this story. And of course, over the course of the post-communist period, it's also true that we can watch that identity being reinforced, you know, reinforced and codified in various ways. But also, they are a transnational ethnic group. You know, in a number of, you know, they're not consolidated in one place. If all their numbers were not, you know, were not scattered for Ukraine and Poland and Eastern Slovakia, it might be different.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, the work I saw done, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, suggests that, you know, not all ethnic identities become national identities, or, you know, to the extent that they don't all become politicized or particized. And I think we haven't seen that, to my knowledge, with the Russian population, or frankly, even in many ways with the Roma population, right? That these have not been ethnic identities that cut across, or that are sort of follow along party lines. What's interesting is what Carol's telling us is that in some ways it's possible that, you know, increasingly the Hungarian identity in Slovakia has stopped, at least among a certain percentage of Hungarians, stopped being a particized issue. That Hungarians are willing to vote for, you know, parties dominated by Slovaks, and Slovaks are willing to vote for parties that are dominated by Hungarians. Not all, not even most. But that, you know, you can see the emergence of, or decline of, the reinforcing nature of party lines and national lines. And I think for the Russian population, it just never crystallized, partly because the group isn't large enough, partly because I think the group doesn't necessarily think of itself, at least from those I talk to who study it, doesn't think of itself as a political entity.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was something about Slovak-Hungarian relations where it was like a zero-sum game. Either the Hungarian was in charge and put Hungarians, everyone from the cleaning lady in the town hall up became Hungarian, or somebody else, and then all their clan. You know, it was much more clearly divided, whereas I suspect there's much more merging in the East. I mean, I don't know, but I think there are other strategies, if you're Rusin, that can be more effective in achieving your life chances than putting your own ethnic group in power.
Well, thank you very much. We have run comfortably or uncomfortably beyond the hour that we had set aside. I've found this to be tremendously helpful and interesting. I'm especially pleased that I gotten to meet people that I've not met before who have an interest in Slovak politics. I want to thank Carol Leff and Karen Henderson, Tim Haughton, and Kevin Deegan-Krause for making generous donation of their time to this. I also want to thank, I see that there are still 43 participants out there in the ether, and we're also grateful for you, for your contributions and your interest. We hope you will join us for further webinars. I think we've got a winner here. We did one about a year ago on Slovak politics, and I think that's a good timing to try to do something in the late winter, early spring. It'll be before the elections, well, 2 years before the elections next time. So, but we have others coming up. We will be letting you all know about. So with that, I don't know if we can really applaud on a webinar. Do the flippers and thank everyone. So good afternoon and thanks again. Farewell.
Thank you.
Do widzenia.